As of July 14th, 2019, it has officially been 20 years since the Blair Witch Project released in theaters across the United States and scared the shit out of, well, everyone who got a chance to see it. As far as theatrically released movies go, this one was really cheap to make. It cost somewhere between $25,000 and $60,000 to shoot, but when you factor in marketing costs, the final budget was somewhere around $300,000, which is still extremely cheap. Whatever its final production cost was, it ended up far exceeding it, because at the end of the day, the Blair Witch Project made over $250 million, which should be familiar if you're a fan of my Halloween videos. And just to be clear, that is an insane margin of profit for any movie to make. It gets even crazier when you consider that it wasn't the first found footage horror movie, and it wasn't even the first one to convince people that the actors in it were actually dead. Those accolades go to The Last Broadcast and Cannibal Holocaust, respectively. One thing you can't deny the Blair Witch Project did, though, is define a genre, and even though Paranormal Activity came out 10 years down the line and caused a ripple effect of tons of other cheap found footage horror movies, the Blair Witch Project has yet to be topped. I mean, really think about it. This one movie got so big that it spawned 3, soon to be 4 video games, multiple documentaries, 2 sequels, a few books, and endless pages of Reddit theories about what really happens in it. But why is that really? Why does this cheap indie horror movie starring 3 no-name 20-somethings still terrify people to this day, and why is it still talked about so much? Well, between the 20th anniversary of the movie and the upcoming video game from Bloober Team, I thought now would be the perfect time to answer that question. Alright, listen, the easiest place to start when talking about the Blair Witch Project is how much thought went into building out its world and the lore behind it before the movie was even greenlit. Even though it came out in 1999, Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez started working on it in 1993 when they were in college together. Every few months, someone in their friend group would bring up the Witch movie, so they decided to form a company and finally work on it for real.
Blair Witch is a definite, rip-off of this In Search of shows.
Yeah, at least the feeling, because I mean, we remember when we were kids, after you watched that show, you would be sitting there in front of the TV, you'd be like, holy moly, Bigfoot.
You said
is real.
Bigfoot running, you're like, oh.
And the Loch Ness Monster is real.
Myrick and Sanchez spent the next 4 years writing a 35-page screenplay and developing a fictional backstory for their movie. And about a year before they started filming, a production designer named Ben Rock came on board. Rock took that general backstory they had already developed and came up with some other unseen supporting characters, like Ellie Kedward and Rustin Parr. Once Haxan had their legend written, they put together an 8-minute mini documentary exploring the Salem witch trials in America, the stories of Kedward and Parr, and of course the legend of the Blair Witch herself. They came up with a book called The Blair Witch Cult, which was written in 1785, and they actually made one of them which they were able to place in a museum's display case for the documentary. As the story goes, several children who lived in Blair County, Maryland, accused Ellie Kedward of luring them into her house so she could draw their blood. Kedward was found guilty of being a witch, and after being banished from her town, she was assumed to have died of exposure to the extremely harsh elements of the 1700s. After telling the Ellie Kedward story, the documentary jumps ahead about 100 years to 1883. In the Blair County town of Black Hill, a man named Rustin Parr claimed that he had abducted and murdered 7 kids under instruction of a ghost of an old lady. And just 7 years later, an 8-year-old girl went missing in the woods. She came back the next day, but unfortunately 3 men who were sent to look for her didn't. They were eventually found in a cave, disemboweled with their teeth pulled and weird symbols carved into their flesh. The missing girl said that the ghost of a woman lured her into the woods, and this was just a year after another young girl was pulled into a local creek by a ghostly white hand. Even though the creek was only 2 feet deep, her body was never found, and for 2 weeks following her disappearance, it filled with bundles of oily sticks and no one could drink the water. Finally, it introduced the idea that time flows differently in the Black Hill Forest, and it ends with the story of 3 student documentarians heading out into the woods only to disappear. That footage was shown on a TV show called Split Screen, and they ended up earning some money from that, and according to Rock, that money was put towards the filming budget of the final movie, which is where that $25,000 figure comes from.
These 3 filmmakers, Dan Myrick, Greg Hale, and Ed Sanchez, collectively known as Haxan Films, discovered a darker tale in the woods of western Maryland.
After that, Myrick and Sanchez got to work on searching for actors. They took out ads in casting magazines and specifically asked for people who were skilled improvisers. After narrowing down the pool of over 2,000 potential actors, Haxan settled on Heather Donahue, Josh Leonard, and Michael C. Williams.
I sat down and one of the directors, Dan Myrick, who I believe sat in this chair not too long ago.
That's right.
Yeah.
They were both here.
And he said to me, "You've served 7 years of a 9-year sentence. Why should we let you out on parole?" And that was how the audition started.
Okay.
So I just had to kind of go from there, create a character, create a story.
Well, that's...
And he said, "Come back tomorrow."
Heather got the job because she looked the filmmakers dead in the eyes and said, "I don't think I should be released." A real town called Burkittsville, Maryland was used in the movie, but its backstory is fictionalized to fit the movie's lore better. In its new history, it was built on the original site of Blair, which got demoted from a county to a township. Another change to the documentary's story was making Ellie Kedward's way more gruesome. So after she was banished, the Blair residents drug her out into the woods and tied her to a tree in the shape of a stick man. Some kids went out into the woods a few days later to see if she had died, but she was still alive. They not only sent their dogs after her, but they also slashed her skin with sticks and knives. Oh, and then they dipped their little grimy hands in blood and pressed them all over her body. And then they hung her from a tree until she was dead. Even though Ellie Kedward was gone, it only took about a month or two for her accusers and local children to start vanishing overnight. So the remaining settlers left the town for good. Almost 40 years later, the deserted Blair Township was rediscovered and renamed to Burkittsville. The Rustin Parr story was also altered slightly from the pitch video. In the movie, Parr grew up with his aunt and uncle in Burkittsville after his parents died. He loved living there, but he was a bit of a loner, so he built a house in the woods about 4 hours outside of the town. He was happy there and loved living alone, but in November of 1940, he abducted 8 kids over the course of 6 months, and on the command of a ghost, killed all but one of them. Once he was done, the ghost said she would leave him alone only if he went into Burkittsville and confessed. He was executed by hanging on November 22nd, 1941. Instead of being 3 men found out in a cave, the search party who went out looking for the missing 8-year-old girl was bumped up to 5, and they were found tied together in the shape of a pentagram at a place called Coffin Rock. The stories were creepy enough on their own, but the important thing here is that they felt real, and it was to the point that while I was writing this video, I had to double check a couple times to see what was fact and what was fiction. The Salem witch trials actually happened about 100 years prior to Ellie Kedward's story, but the ways in which she was tried and executed by the townsfolk under the guise of religion were not far off from things that actually happened to innocent people in real life. The story of Rustin Parr is also 100% believable. The idea of a completely self-sufficient man living out in the woods of Maryland in a house that he built by himself only 2 years after the Great Depression is something nobody would ever question. This extremely detailed backstory was then doled out to Heather, Mike, and Josh in chunks by modern-day residents of Burkittsville, and after 2 fishermen tell them that Coffin Rock is only 20 minutes outside of town, they head out into the Black Hills and never return. The Blair Witch Project filmed over an 8-day period from October 23rd until Halloween in 1997 with that same 35-page script. For context, a normal script clocks in at around 120 pages, which translates to 1 minute of movie per page. But since this movie was mostly going to be made up of fake interviews and the improvised camping scenes, they only had to work with a short treatment. It was mostly filmed in the Seneca Creek State Park in Montgomery County, Maryland, which stood in as the Black Hills Forest. Getting ready for the shoot took the people at Haxon about 6 weeks, and since they had nothing in terms of a budget, the entire crew of 15 or so people slept on the floor in the Germantown house that Sanchez and his girlfriend lived in. Heather, Mike, and Josh were each given high 8 cameras and training on how to use them. In addition to that, they were given GPS systems which they used to find milk crates that gave individual explanations of what they needed to improvise every day. Myrick, Sanchez, and their producer Greg Hale had the campsite route meticulously planned out weeks in advance. They also came up with ways to scare the actors while they were sleeping inside their tents. Those ended up just being really annoying to the actors because they knew it was the film team and that meant they had to work.
We didn't light one the first night.
And nothing happened.
We light fires, they know. I haven't heard anything follow us. We should even turn that light off, too.
All right.
Seriously, anything that's going to attract attention to us at this point.
Okay.
As shooting went on, they were also increasingly deprived of food. So on the first day, they got a sandwich and a bag of chips, but then on the second day, they would just get the sandwich. And on the third day, they would just get the bag of chips, and on the fourth day, they wouldn't have lunch at all. The way Hale put it to the actors was that while their safety was a primary concern, their comfort was not. By the end of the shoot, the actors were all so tired and hungry that a lot of the altercations they had written for them had real tension underneath, which explains why a lot of the screaming matches sound so real. When it was all said and done, the actors turned in over 20 hours of raw footage, which was then cut down to 2.5 hours over the course of 8 months. All of this was going on at the perfect moment where the internet was just starting to become what we knew it as in the early 2000s. But of course, there weren't a lot of websites out there for people to go talk about horror movies on. Because of that, every time the episode of Split Screen would come on and feature the mini doc, followed by the host telling people to let them know whether or not they thought the footage was real or fake, people would flood the show's message boards and bog down the site. That got the Split Screen host to hit up Haxon while they were editing the movie, and he gave them the idea to take the lore that they built and post it on their own simple website. The site is still up in all its late 90s glory, and if you click around you can find some pretty cool stuff. There's video clips released by the University of Maryland, photos released by the Frederick County Sheriff's Office, and finally Heather's journal, which was found buried underneath the foundation of Rustin Parr's house. As they were adding more info into the site, the guys at Haxan had the super smart idea to insert themselves into the marketing narrative as a company who was hired by Heather's mom to compile the literal found footage. They knew everything there was to know about the story since they wrote it, so they would search for message boards where people were doing their best to piece together the legend of the Blair Witch, and then they would leave breadcrumbs for them to follow. Having people talk about their movie was fun for them, so they pushed it farther and set up an email list and started selling merch featuring the Stickman, which I wish I had so badly. No one really questioned it either because again, everyone knew they were the ones constructing the movie from the found footage. In the meantime, one of the executive producers started doing small screenings in New York City. He would take the reel up to the projection box and tell the projector to make copies and give them out to his friends. People started sharing that unfinished copy of the movie online, which caught the eye of disgraced scumbag Harry Knowles, who then told his readers to check out the movie at Sundance. And by the way, critics love Sundance because it's exclusive, and if you're there, you might get to be the arbiter of the next big indie mega hit like Hereditary. Twitter didn't really exist in 1999, but if it did, critics would have turned on tunnel vision to convince themselves and anyone who would listen that it wasn't just a movie. And that's why the Sundance screening turned out to be a pivotal moment for the Blair Witch Project, since the now defunct Artisan Films bought it for $1.1 million. I'm cutting back in here to talk about how at this point it would have been really easy for Haxan to let Artisan take over with the marketing, put the movie in theaters, and then they would just collect whatever the movie made. Instead of taking the easy road though, they invented some marketing tactics that were completely unheard of in 1999. So when you take what Haxan had done before they sold the movie and combine it with what Artisan did after they bought it, you get the literal invention of the term viral marketing. Instead of paying for expensive ad slots before movies, Artisan decided to leak the trailer through MTV. They also constructed a full documentary that you can watch on YouTube for free and ran it on the Sci-Fi Channel. The original plan for the movie was to only have 1/3 of it be found footage, but in the editing room they heavily favored the found footage segments and had a ton of documentary footage left over, so that was the footage they used for the documentary. Artisan of course didn't tell anyone that the documentary was fake, and along with the IMDb pages for Heather, Mike, and Josh saying they were missing and presumed dead, that perpetuated the idea that the Blair Witch Project was real. Hell, at the end of the day, we don't even know if Heather, Josh, or Mike died. The goriest thing we get to see in the entire movie is a bloody bundle of hair and teeth. It's the implication of what happened to Josh that makes that creepy gift so scary. And that wasn't always the case either. Artisan didn't like the ending after they bought it, so Haxan got the whole gang back together to shoot 4 alternate endings. You're looking at them right now, but they are available on YouTube, so check the link down below. But long story short, they take out all the tension. They show you exactly what happens, and in my opinion, that ruins the fun. The actors who did come back didn't mind doing so because they made more money on those reshoots than the 8 days they took filming the entire movie beforehand. The same idea of implied horror goes for the stickmen and piles of rocks as well. If you read up on the lore beforehand, you'd know that Ellie Kedward was stretched out in the shape of a stickman, and that 5 men were disemboweled and tied in the shape of a pentagram at Coffin Rock. But if you paid attention or talked to someone who had seen it before you could piece all that together by yourself. The Blair Witch Project essentially connected people and got them talking about a movie in a way that no other horror movie had before. And once the group is in the woods, even when the plot starts to drag, the movie isn't any less horrific. That's because most people have experienced 5 or 10 minutes walking just a little too far off the trail in the woods and getting lost. So it was easy for them to let their imaginations run wild with thoughts of starving to death and never being found. Haxan also deserves a ton of credit for not only setting the Blair Witch Project around Halloween, but then filming it around the same time as well. Even through the grainy Hi8 cameras that the movie was shot on, the Black Hills Forest are dripping with the perfect shade of orange that we all remember fall having when we were a kid. I'm not saying that the movie wouldn't work if it was shot in November or early December, but say whatever you want. The Blair Witch Project has that feel of someone watching you. We all have an October that washes away when November rolls around. And when it comes to urban legends like the story of Ellie Kedward the Witch and Rustin Parr the child killer, people want to believe them. Think of all the terrifying stuff happening on the internet right now. There are tons of creepy urban legends out there like Slenderman, Search and Rescue Woods, and Local 58, and we're just as happy to believe them now as we were back in 1999. At the end of the 20th century, we were starting to realize that there really isn't anything left in the world to discover. So when 2 film students presented us with a theatrically released compilation of college kids losing their minds and disappearing into the woods of Maryland, the vast majority of the people who went out to see it were happy to suspend their disbelief. When you take the near perfect performances from Heather, Mike, and Josh and you combine them with the meticulously crafted backstory, and then you combine that with the marketing that Haxan and Artisan did, you get one of the scariest horror movies of all time. It never managed to take the top spot in the box office, but since the budget was so tiny, it didn't really have to. Just like the model that Jason Blum rigidly adheres to with the movies he produces, when you're working with a budget of less than $100,000, but your movie ends up receiving critical acclaim in a wide release, you don't need to make much more to turn a profit. Even so, Jason Blum's movies started out with budgets of $1 million, which has been bumped up to $5 million due to the model's success. So by that logic, the Blair Witch Project was in an even better position than the majority of Blum's productions, Paranormal Activity excluded. So while we have yet to see the Blair Witch on screen, what makes her such a petrifying presence is that people truly believed in her. It really did get to the point where Heather went to a party with one of the producers and someone there refused to believe that she was the one she said she was because Heather was dead. She even showed this guy her driver's license and he still wouldn't believe her. So next time you're looking at Twitter or Facebook and you see a stupid news story and you think to yourself, how do people believe this shit? Just look back about 20 years and consider how easy it was for some college buddies to make people think that they were watching the disappearance of 3 very real people. And that is the horror of the Blair Witch Project explained. I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I had making it. As it turns out, I actually have 2 more ideas to make this Blair Witch Project a trilogy. The second video will be about Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 and how there's kind of a hidden movie within it. And the third one is about the overarching lore of the entire franchise, but mostly focusing on what's introduced and confirmed in 2016's Blair Witch. And those 2 videos alone are on top of the 100 other horror movies I'd love to cover from my childhood. Stuff like Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, or The Fly, or Reanimator. And this is where I ask you for a totally free huge favor. If you like this video, share it with a friend and let me know why you liked it down in the comments below. And when you subscribe, if you're not already, make sure you hit the notification bell. And if you want to be super awesome when you get a notification coming through, just do me a huge favor and click it. I put a ton of work into these videos and I guarantee if it's something I put out, you'll probably like it. Anyway guys, my name is Jimmy Champane and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.